There's a man sitting in a small cell right now. He has been sitting there for over 20 years. He knows the date he might die. The state told him. It is written on official paperwork. And yet, that date has already been postponed 3 times. How does a government decide exactly when a human being will be put to death? It is not a judge who picks the final date. It is not a jury. By the time an execution date is set, those people are long gone from the process. What remains is something far more bureaucratic, far more layered, and in many ways far more disturbing than a single gavel coming down in a courtroom. The machinery that moves an inmate from sentencing to execution involves governors, attorneys general, federal courts, pharmaceutical suppliers, and in some states, a board of people you have never heard of who meet in a room you'll never see. Each one holds a piece of the decision. None of them holds all of it. Between 1976, when the Supreme Court reinstated capital punishment in the United States, and today, over 1,600 people have been executed by the state. But for every person executed, there are roughly 9 people on death row who have been waiting longer than a decade. Some have waited over 30 years. The system that is supposed to deliver finality has instead created a permanent population of people living in legal limbo. What you're about to see is how that system actually works. Not the version taught in civics class. The real version. The one with drug shortages, last-minute injunctions, governors who act in the final hour, and inmates who survive their own scheduled execution dates more than once. Stay with this until the end, because the final chapter of this story contains a detail that changes how you see the entire process. If you have never seen how death row actually functions from the inside out, hit subscribe right now. This channel covers the systems most people never examine. You do not want to miss what comes next. The sentence is handed down in a courtroom. The jury recommends death. The judge imposes it, and then something unexpected happens. Almost nothing. For years. This is the first thing most people do not understand about capital punishment in the United States. The sentence and the execution are separated by a vast bureaucratic wilderness that can last decades. According to data compiled by the Death Penalty Information Center, the average time between sentencing and execution in the United States has grown from just over 6 years in the 1980s to more than 20 years today. In some states, it exceeds 25 years. That gap is not an accident. It is the system functioning exactly as it was designed to function, though not necessarily for the reasons its architects intended. When a person is sentenced to death, they're transferred to a designated death row facility. In Texas, that is the Polunsky unit in Livingston. In California, it is San Quentin, now formally renamed San Quentin Rehabilitation Center. In Florida, it is Union Correctional Institution. Each state with capital punishment maintains its own death row population under its own set of conditions. And each state controls its own timeline. The first legal mechanism that slows the process is the automatic appeal. In every state that carries out executions, a death sentence triggers an automatic review by the state's highest court. This is not optional. It happens regardless of whether the defendant wants it. The court must review the trial record for constitutional errors, improper jury instructions, ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, evidentiary violations. This review alone can take several years. What followed the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976 was a legal arms race between state governments pushing to carry out sentences and federal courts expanding the grounds on which those sentences could be challenged. By the 1990s, death row inmates had access to multiple layers of review: state post-conviction proceedings, federal habeas corpus petitions, and appeals to the United States Supreme Court. Consider the documented case of Gary Alvord in Florida. He was sentenced to death in 1974 and remained on death row for 39 years, eventually dying of natural causes in 2013 without ever being executed. His case was delayed repeatedly due to questions about his mental competency. The courts could not execute him if he did not understand why he was being executed. That legal standard, established in Ford v. Wainwright by the Supreme Court in 1986, added an entirely new category of delay to the system. Then there is the case of Thomas Knight, also in Florida, who spent decades cycling through the courts on competency and penalty phase reviews before finally being executed in 2014. His case illustrated how a single unresolved legal question could restart the appellate clock entirely. The system at this stage is not controlled by any single person. It is controlled by a sequence, and that sequence has no fixed speed. What makes this particularly significant is what happens to the inmate during this period. Death row conditions in most U.S. facilities involve 22 to 24 hours per day in a single cell, limited human contact, and near total restriction from general prison population. According to testimony gathered by human rights researchers and court records from multiple states, the psychological toll of this extended isolation is severe and well documented. Inmates describe existing in a permanent state of anticipatory dread, never knowing whether a given year will be their last. But the bureaucratic structure does not factor in psychological cost. It processes legal questions, and there are always more legal questions. The second major mechanism of delay is the post-conviction investigation. After sentencing, defense attorneys frequently uncover evidence that was not presented at trial. Witness recantations, forensic re-examinations, newly available DNA analysis. According to the Innocence Project, as of recent counts, more than 190 people have been exonerated from death row since 1973. Each exoneration required years of post-conviction legal work. Each one also introduced doubt into the broader system about the reliability of death sentences as a class. This doubt has consequences. Courts that might once have moved quickly through habeas petitions began scrutinizing them more carefully. Federal judges began granting more stays. The pipeline slowed, and so the population of death row grew. Not because more people were being sentenced to death. In fact, death sentences have declined significantly since their peak in the mid-1990s, but because the pace of executions slowed faster than the pace of new sentences decreased. By the time a state is ready to set an execution date, it has already cleared a legal obstacle course that most people never see. There's a specific moment when the abstract becomes concrete, when a name on a legal docket becomes a date on a calendar. That moment is when the state sets an execution date. In most states, this power belongs to the governor. In some, it is the attorney general. In others, it is a combination of both. The mechanics differ, but the principle is the same. An executive authority must affirmatively schedule the death. It does not happen automatically. This is not a minor procedural point. It means that politics enters the process directly. In Texas, which has carried out more executions than any other state, over 590 since 1982, according to the Death Penalty Information Center. The scheduling process begins when the Texas Department of Criminal Justice formally requests a warrant of execution from a state district court. The judge issues the warrant, setting a specific date. That date is typically 60 to 90 days out, creating a window during which final appeals can be filed. In Florida, the governor issues the death warrant personally. This is a documented, formalized act. Former Governor Bob Graham signed death warrants in batches. Former Governor Jeb Bush signed them in the final months before Florida imposed a brief moratorium following a botched execution in 2006. The decision of when to sign and when not to has historically tracked with political calculations, election cycles, and public sentiment. Research published in academic criminology journals has documented correlations between execution, scheduling, and electoral calendars in multiple states. Governors facing re-election in states with strong pro-death penalty constituencies have shown increased rates of warrant signing in the months preceding elections. This pattern does not mean every execution date is politically motivated, but it does mean that the timing of state-sanctioned death is not purely procedural. Once a date is set, the legal machinery accelerates. Defense attorneys immediately file emergency motions, new habeas petitions, and requests for stays of execution. Federal courts, including circuit courts, and in some cases the Supreme Court, must respond within the window before the scheduled date. This is where the process becomes almost impossible to observe from the outside in real time. Consider the final weeks leading up to the 2011 execution of Troy Davis in Georgia. Davis had been convicted in 1991 of murdering a police officer. Over the following 2 decades, 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses who testified against him recanted or changed their accounts. No physical evidence linked him to the crime. His case became an international focal point for death penalty opposition. Davis had 3 prior execution dates set and stayed. On September 21, 2011, his 4th scheduled execution date, the Supreme Court declined to intervene. The Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles, the body empowered in that state to grant clemency, had already denied his petition. He was executed at 11:08 p.m. His case illustrated every pressure point in the scheduling system simultaneously. Executive warrant, clemency board review, international pressure, Supreme Court intervention, and the final irreversibility of the act itself. The clemency process is its own mechanism and is frequently misunderstood. In most states, a governor may commute a death sentence to life imprisonment without parole. In some states, an independent pardons board holds this power and the governor cannot override it. In Georgia, the State Board of Pardons and Paroles has the exclusive authority to grant clemency, and the governor has no unilateral power to stop an execution once that board has ruled. According to data from the Death Penalty Information Center, clemency in capital cases has become increasingly rare. In the 1970s and early 1980s, grants of clemency were more common, often reflecting gubernatorial discomfort with individual cases. By the 2000s, the rate had dropped dramatically. Between 1976 and recent years, there have been fewer than 300 clemency grants in capital cases, compared to over 1,600 executions. The window is narrowing, and the actors inside it are making decisions that cannot be undone. Even after the date is set, even after clemency is denied, even after the Supreme Court has declined to intervene, there's still one more layer of the system that can stop everything: the drugs. Beginning around 2010, a quiet crisis began disrupting execution schedules across the United States. European pharmaceutical manufacturers, responding to pressure from death penalty abolition advocates and in compliance with European Union regulations, began refusing to supply the drugs used in lethal injections to American corrections departments. Sodium thiopental, a barbiturate long used as the first drug in the standard 3-drug execution protocol, became virtually unavailable to state prison systems. This was not a legal ruling. It was a supply chain failure, and it threw capital punishment logistics into chaos. States responded in different ways. Some sought alternative drug combinations. Some turned to compounding pharmacies, small specialty pharmacies that mix drugs to order, to produce execution drugs outside the normal pharmaceutical supply chain. Some states experimented with single drug protocols using pentobarbital or midazolam. Others imposed execution moratoriums while they searched for legal and available drug supplies. The consequences of these experiments were severe and documented. On April 29, 2014, the state of Oklahoma executed Clayton Lockett using a newly adopted drug protocol involving midazolam. According to official investigative reports and witness accounts documented by journalists present in the viewing room, Lockett did not lose consciousness as expected. He writhed on the gurney. He attempted to lift his head. He spoke. The execution was halted, but Lockett died of a heart attack 43 minutes after the process began. The Oklahoma Department of Public Safety conducted a formal investigation. Its report confirmed that the 4-line had been improperly placed, causing the drugs to enter tissue rather than the bloodstream. The botched execution generated national and international outrage and led directly to a lengthy delay in executions in that state. Oklahoma's case was not isolated. In January 2014, Ohio used midazolam in the execution of Dennis McGuire. Witnesses reported that McGuire appeared to struggle and gasp for approximately 26 minutes before dying. This triggered immediate legal challenges in multiple states that had adopted similar protocols. These events forced federal courts to examine something they had largely avoided: whether specific drug combinations constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. In 2015, the Supreme Court addressed this directly in Glossop versus Gross. The court, in a 5-4 decision, upheld Oklahoma's use of midazolam. Justice Sonia Sotomayor's dissent stated that the majority had allowed what she described as a method that could produce severe pain to proceed because no perfect alternative existed. But the litigation did not end there. Each new drug combination triggered new legal challenges. Each challenge could result in a stay of execution. The drug supply problem had created a permanent new front in the legal war over capital punishment. By 2020, some states have been unable to carry out a single execution in years, not because of legal rulings striking down capital punishment, but because they could not obtain the drugs. California, which has the largest death row population in the country with over 600 condemned inmates, has not carried out an execution since 2006, partly due to ongoing litigation over lethal injection protocols. The system designed to deliver finality had become entangled in pharmaceutical logistics, constitutional chemistry debates, and medical ethics. Corrections departments became deeply secretive about their drug sources. Several states passed laws shielding the identities of drug suppliers from public disclosure. Courts divided on whether that secrecy was constitutional. The entire mechanism was obscured behind layers of legal protection designed to prevent the very challenges that kept producing delays. Death row inmates and their attorneys sued for information about the drugs that would be used to kill them. Some courts said they had a right to know. Others disagreed. The result was a patchwork of disclosure rules that varied by state and often by individual judge. And then the federal government re-entered the picture. What happens next involves federal executions, a compressed timeline that shook the entire country, and a decision made at the highest level of government that resulted in 13 executions in 6 months. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next chapter does not slow down. In July 2019, United States Attorney General William Barr announced that the federal government would resume executions for the first time since 2003. The announcement was precise. 5 inmates on federal death row had been selected. Execution dates had been set. The drug protocol had been chosen. A single drug, pentobarbital, sourced through means the government would not publicly disclose. What followed was a compressed, aggressive execution schedule unlike anything the modern American legal system had seen. Between July 2020 and January 2021, the federal government carried out 13 executions. 13 in 6 months. For context, in the prior 17 years, the federal government had carried out 0. The pace was deliberate, and it was contested at every step. 3 of those executions occurred in the final days before the inauguration of President Joe Biden, who had stated publicly that he opposed the death penalty. The Trump administration's Justice Department moved with explicit urgency to complete the executions before the presidential transition. On January 13, 2021, just 7 days before Biden took office, Lisa Montgomery became the first woman executed by the federal government since 1953. On January 14th, Corey Johnson was executed. On January 16th, Dustin Higgs was executed. Federal courts were inundated with emergency filings. In several of the cases, judges granted stays of execution that were immediately appealed by the Justice Department. The Supreme Court, working in the middle of the night on multiple occasions, vacated those stays and decisions that were often unsigned and provided no reasoning. This procedural device, known as the shadow docket, allowed the court to make life and death decisions without full briefing, oral argument, or written explanation. The shadow docket had existed for years as a mechanism for emergency procedural matters. Its use in capital cases during this period drew intense criticism from legal scholars and several justices themselves. Justice Sotomayor wrote in one related context that the court was making important decisions in darkness. Justice Elena Kagan described the expanded use of the shadow docket in a 2021 lecture as a significant development that warranted public scrutiny. What the federal execution sprint of 2020 and 2021 revealed was something important about how the system works when the political will to accelerate it is strong enough. The legal obstacles did not disappear. The pharmaceutical secrecy laws were challenged. The drug protocols were contested. Inmates' attorneys filed emergency motions in rapid succession. And yet, the executions proceeded. The system, when pushed by executive determination, could move fast. The same system that had allowed inmates to wait for 20 or 30 years could compress that timeline dramatically when it chose to. This raises a question that legal scholars have debated for decades. Is the length of time an inmate spends on death row itself a form of cruel and unusual punishment? Justice John Paul Stevens raised this question in his later years on the court. International human rights bodies have argued that the combination of prolonged death row confinement and eventual execution constitutes a form of torture. American courts have not accepted this argument. The Supreme Court declined to rule on the question in Knight v. Florida in 1999, with Justices Breyer and Stevens dissenting from that denial. The question remained unresolved, but the federal execution sprint created another data point. It demonstrated that the decades-long wait was not an immutable feature of the system. It was a product of choices, legal choices, pharmaceutical choices, political choices. And when those choices aligned in the direction of acceleration, the wait could collapse entirely. The 13 federal executions of 2020 and 2021 were carried out in a country that was simultaneously managing a global pandemic. Several of the executed inmates and their attorneys contracted COVID-19 in the weeks before the scheduled dates. Requests for delays based on pandemic conditions were denied. The system, at that point, was not responding to external conditions. It was following its own internal logic to a conclusion. Here is what most people never think about. The person who actually carries out the execution is not a doctor. In most states, medical professionals are prohibited by their own ethical codes from participating in executions. The American Medical Association, the American Nurses Association, and other professional bodies have long held that participation in executions violates medical ethics. In most states, law or prison policy prohibits the identification of execution team members. Who then does it? According to documented accounts from corrections officials, former wardens, and investigative journalism, execution teams are typically composed of prison staff volunteers, corrections officers, and other employees who come forward to participate. They're trained specifically for the task. Their identities are protected by law in many states. In some states, the law extends this protection so broadly that not even the courts can compel disclosure. Robert Blecker, a law professor and capital punishment scholar, has written extensively about the distance that modern lethal injection protocols have created between the state and the act of execution. By designing the process to look clinical, a gurney, and for a sequence of drugs, the state has made the act appear medical even while the medical profession refuses to participate in it. The execution team, in practice, works from a checklist. According to former Texas warden Jim Willett, who oversaw 89 executions at the Huntsville unit before retiring, the process is relentlessly procedural. Every step is documented. Every action is recorded. The warden reads the death warrant aloud. The inmate is given an opportunity to make a final statement. The curtain opens to allow witnesses to observe. The drugs are administered in sequence. A physician who has agreed to participate, typically not to administer the drugs but to pronounce death, is present. The final pronouncement of death is its own legal threshold. Once pronounced, the body is released to the family or, if unclaimed, interred in the prison cemetery. In Huntsville, Texas, there's a prison cemetery called Captain Joe Bird Cemetery. It contains the graves of inmates who were never claimed by family. Many of the markers are simple concrete posts with numbers. Some of the executed are buried there. According to reporting by Texas Monthly and other outlets, the cemetery has operated continuously since the 19th century and holds hundreds of graves. It is maintained by inmates. The full arc of the system, from sentencing through decades of appeals, through drug procurement and protocol litigation, through executive warrant and clemency denial, through the shadow docket and the execution team's checklist, ends here. In a numbered grave, or in a funeral home, or in the hands of a family that has spent decades waiting for their own kind of resolution. There is a final detail that rarely makes headlines. Executions are sometimes witnessed by the victim's family. Corrections departments in most states offer this option. According to documented accounts, the experience is profoundly complicated. Some family members report feeling the closure they expected. Others report feeling nothing. A significant number report that watching the execution did not resolve their grief, that it added another layer to it. One documented account from the family of a murder victim in Texas interviewed by a researcher at the University of Minnesota's Death Penalty Research Initiative described watching the execution of the man who killed their daughter and feeling, in the moment of his death, not relief, but a kind of emptiness. They described wondering for the first time whether the process had been designed for them at all. The system was not designed for the families. It was not designed for the inmates. It was designed by institutions for institutions to process a legal outcome through a set of procedures that carry the weight of legitimacy, the appearance of precision, and the irreversibility of finality. And once it finishes, it begins again. Right now, there are over 2,000 people on death row in the United States. Each one has a case winding through the same machinery. Each one has an attorney filing motions, a state preparing responses, a governor who may one day sign a warrant, and a pharmaceutical supply chain somewhere in the background that may or may not have what is needed when the date arrives. The system that decides when an inmate will be executed does not decide quickly. But when it finally decides, nothing else matters. If this changed how you see the criminal justice system, watch our next video on how death row inmates spend their final 24 hours. The documented accounts, the last meals, the final phone calls, and the moments that corrections officers almost never talk about publicly. It is linked right now. Subscribe, like, share, comment, and turn on the notification button. The truth in that video is harder to sit with than anything in this one.